When Rome finally collapsed, Europe didn't just lose an empire. It lost everything that made it civilized. Cities crumbled, trade vanished, and chaos reigned across the continent. In the ashes of marble roads and fallen statues, new tribes fought for scraps of power: Goths, Lombards, Saxons, each carving out their tiny kingdoms in a world that had forgotten the word empire. But in the misty forests of Gaul, a different people were stirring, rough, determined, and guided by something greater than greed. They called themselves the Franks. They were not Rome's heirs by blood, but by ambition. They would take what the Romans left behind, their roads, their faith, their dream of unity, and rebuild it in their own image. From a scattered tribe rose a dynasty that would redefine the Middle Ages, and at its heart stood a man whose name still echoes through 1,000 years of European history: Charlemagne, the warrior king who turned chaos into conquest and forged the first true empire of medieval Europe. This is the story of how the Franks rose from the ruins of Rome to shape the future of a continent. Before we march into the chaos of post-Roman Europe, make sure to hit subscribe and ring that bell, because the battles, the empires, and the legends are just getting started. So, saddle up, and let's dive into the story. When the Roman Empire fell, it didn't just mark the end of an age. It shattered the very idea of civilization in Europe. The roads that once carried legions and merchants alike fell silent, choked by weeds and dust. The marble cities that had echoed with debates, trade, and laughter turned into hollow shells, haunted reminders of a world that once was. Across the continent, warlords rose where governors once ruled, and the disciplined order of Roman law gave way to the raw brutality of survival. In the vacuum left behind, entire peoples moved: Goths, Vandals, Lombards, Saxons, all carving out fragile realms in the ruins of the empire. But these new kingdoms were built on fear, not stability. Roads became borders, rivers became frontiers, and life for the common man became short, violent, and uncertain. The concept of a united Europe, one people, one law, one order, vanished like smoke in the wind. It was a continent without direction, a world where old gods lingered and new faiths struggled to take root. Yet, even in this chaos, the embers of Rome's legacy still glowed faintly: its language, its religion, and its dream of empire refused to die. And in the misty forests of northern Gaul, a tribe of fierce warriors began to fan that spark back to life. They called themselves the Franks. To outsiders, they seemed little more than rough barbarians, men who lived by the sword, spoke a harsh tongue, and followed no written law. But beneath that rugged exterior was something rare for the age: unity. While other tribes splintered into rival factions, the Franks stood together under powerful chieftains who saw opportunity in Rome's downfall. They weren't content with raiding ruins. They wanted to rule them. Over time, these warrior bands began to absorb what the Romans left behind, adopting their weapons, their infrastructure, even their religion. When their leader Clovis converted to Christianity at the urging of his wife, it wasn't just a personal choice, it was a political masterstroke. Suddenly, the Franks weren't outsiders anymore. They were protectors of the faith, allies of the church, and heirs to the spiritual authority that Rome had once claimed. It gave them legitimacy, power, and purpose. As the Goths and Vandals faded into history, the Franks grew stronger, building alliances with bishops, expanding their lands, and turning their once barbarian kingdom into a rising Christian power. The old Roman provinces of Gaul slowly transformed under Frankish rule, not restored, but reborn. They took the roads Rome built and marched upon them as conquerors. They claimed the Latin tongue and mixed it with their own, giving birth to the roots of what would one day become the French language. They built courts, issued decrees, and most importantly, began to think beyond the next battle. For the first time in centuries, Europe had a people who dared to dream of unity again. But this new order was fragile, a kingdom still haunted by tribal rivalries and held together by force of will. The Merovingian kings, descendants of Clovis, wore their long hair as symbols of divine rule. But beneath the golden crowns, corruption festered. By the 7th century, the once mighty bloodline had grown weak, their authority slipping into the hands of powerful nobles who truly commanded the armies. Yet even that decay would pave the way for something greater: a transformation. that would soon give birth to one of history's most formidable dynasties. Because in the heart of this chaos, in the halls of Frankish power, a family was rising, the Carolingians, and from their line would emerge a man who would take the dream of Rome, wrap it in steel and faith, and march it across Europe. His name was Charlemagne, and through him, the Middle Ages would find its first true emperor. By the early 8th century, the Frankish kingdom stood at a crossroads, rich in land but fractured by ambition. The Merovingian kings had become little more than figureheads, their long hair and royal titles masking the truth. Real power now rested in the hands of the mayors of the palace, the generals who commanded armies and loyalty alike. Among them rose one man whose name would echo across history, Charles Martel, the Hammer. He wasn't born into a throne. He seized it with grit, blood, and brilliance. Europe, meanwhile, faced a storm unlike anything it had seen since the fall of Rome. From across the southern seas, the armies of Islam were sweeping through the world. The Umayyad Caliphate had conquered North Africa, crushed the Visigothic kingdom in Spain, and now its banners flew just beyond the Pyrenees. To the Christian kingdoms of Europe, it felt as if a tidal wave was coming, and at its edge stood the Franks, the last true shield of the West. In 732 AD, that wave finally crashed. The Muslim general Abdul Rahman al-Ghafiqi led a massive force northward, raiding deep into Frankish territory. Towns burned, churches fell, and panic spread like wildfire. Most rulers would have fled or begged for peace, but Martel didn't flinch. He called his warriors not from noble castles, but from the fields and villages of Gaul. These weren't pampered knights. They were hardened men, loyal to gold and survival more than glory. Martel knew that to win, he needed discipline, not titles. He forged his troops into a professional corps, paid them directly, armed them with better weapons, and drilled them like the legions of old Rome. For perhaps the first time since the empire's fall, Europe had an organized army again, a machine, not a mob. As the invaders advanced toward Tours, Martel chose his ground carefully, anchoring his men on high terrain and letting the enemy come to him. What followed was not a grand charge, but a brutal stand. For 7 days, Frankish spears held the line against wave after wave of cavalry. When the dust settled, Abdul Rahman lay dead, his army broken. The Battle of Tours was more than a victory, it was a turning point. Europe had stopped the Muslim advance, and Charles Martel became the man who saved Christendom. Yet Martel didn't fight for faith alone. He fought for the survival of his people and the foundation of a new kind of power. He realized that loyalty couldn't be inherited, it had to be earned and paid for. So he began granting lands not as gifts, but as military contracts, tying soldiers to service through obligation and reward. It was the seed of what would later become the feudal system, but in Martel's hands. It wasn't about nobles and peasants, it was about efficiency. His army was a brotherhood of necessity, united not by bloodlines, but by shared purpose. This, more than any victory, was his true genius. By transforming warriors into professionals, Martel laid the groundwork for an empire still to come. The Franks had evolved from raiders into rulers, from tribes into a nation capable of defending itself against the greatest powers of the age. And though Martel would never wear a crown, his legacy would outshine kings. His reforms, his victories, and his vision would pass to his son, a small, sharp-eyed man named Pepin, who understood that power must be both won and sanctified. The church had blessed Martel's sword, now it would bless his bloodline. Together, faith and force would forge the next great chapter of Frankish destiny. Because Charles Martel didn't just save Europe, he built the foundation for an empire that was coming. One that would soon be ruled by a man greater than any who came before, Charlemagne. After Charles Martel's death, the hammer that forged Europe's salvation was passed to his son, Pepin the Short, a man of small stature but monumental ambition. The Franks stood at a strange moment in history, powerful, organized, and feared, yet ruled by a ghost. The Merovingian kings still wore the crown, but everyone knew it meant nothing. They were kings in name, puppets whose strings were pulled by the real power behind the throne. The mayors of the palace. Pepin knew that if the Franks were to become more than just a kingdom of warriors, they needed legitimacy, a divine stamp that would make their rule unshakable. So he did what no Frankish leader had dared before. He went to the church. In a world where the sword and the cross often clashed, Pepin understood that one could not survive without the other. He sent envoys to Pope Zachary with a simple but revolutionary question: who should be king? The one with the title, or the one who truly holds power? The Pope's answer changed history. With papal blessing, Pepin dethroned the last Merovingian ruler, cut off his royal locks, the symbol of sacred kingship, and sent him to a monastery. And just like that, a new dynasty was born. In 751 AD, Pepin was anointed by the Pope's own representative, his forehead marked with holy oil. The first king in Europe crowned by the church itself. It wasn't just politics, it was propaganda with divine fire. The Franks now ruled by the grace of God. In return, Pepin became the sword arm of the papacy, defending the church against its enemies. When the Lombards threatened Rome, Pepin marched south, smashed their armies, and gifted the conquered lands to the Pope, a move that created the Papal States and bound the Church and the Franks in a sacred alliance. This was more than strategy. It was the birth of a partnership that would shape Western Europe for centuries. Pepin's reign was short, but decisive, and in his twilight years, he looked to his sons to continue what he had started. Among them was a young man whose energy and ambition burned brighter than all others, Charles. Later known as Charlemagne, Charles the Great, from the moment he took the throne in 768, Charlemagne was restless. He wasn't content with being just a king. He wanted to be a ruler in the old Roman sense, builder, lawgiver, conqueror, and savior of civilization itself. While other rulers guarded borders, Charlemagne expanded them. He reorganized the Frankish lands, demanded loyalty from nobles, and reformed the army into a disciplined force ready for endless campaigns. But his genius wasn't just military, it was moral and political. He understood that conquest meant nothing without stability, and stability meant faith. So he used Christianity as both a sword and a shield, uniting tribes under one God, one law, one crown. Every victory became a mission, every campaign, a crusade before crusades even existed. And behind it all, he carried the legacy of his father and grandfather. The idea that the Franks weren't just surviving the ruins of Rome, they were rebuilding it in their own image. The alliance with the church made his wars holy, his rule sacred, and his destiny unstoppable. By the time the dust settled, Europe would never be the same. Because Pepin the Short may have built the throne, but Charlemagne was about to build the empire that would stand upon it. Charlemagne didn't just inherit a throne, he inherited an idea that power meant order, and order needed structure. When he looked across his empire, stretching from the Atlantic to the Danube, he didn't see borders, he saw gears in a massive machine that needed to move in perfect sync. And at the heart of that machine was his army, the most organized and disciplined force Europe had seen since Rome's legions. But this wasn't the Rome of marble. This was a kingdom of mud, forests, and faith. Charlemagne's army was built, not in the Senate halls, but in the fields and churches of Gaul. Every man owed service, not to a lord, but to the king himself, a radical idea for its time. Through decrees like the Capitulare de exercitu promovendo, Charlemagne laid out laws that read like a playbook for domination. Who must serve, what they must bring, how they must march, and even how long they must fight. His empire didn't rely on feudal levies or loose alliances. It ran on obligation, logistics, and loyalty, enforced with brutal precision. Local counts were his administrators, tasked with raising troops, securing supplies, and ensuring every sword was accounted for. Free men, bound by duty, provided infantry, nobles brought cavalry, fully equipped at their own expense. It was a pyramid of power with Charlemagne sitting squarely at the top, every level feeding the one above it. But this wasn't just about manpower, it was about mindset. The Franks believed they were fighting for God's empire on earth, a divine mission that turned campaigns into holy work, and that faith made them relentless. Charlemagne's military genius wasn't in flashy tactics, it was in planning. He turned war into a calendar. Spring was for mobilization, summer for campaigns, and autumn for logistics and consolidation. Rivers became his highways, forests his fortresses, and roads his lifelines. Engineers built bridges, carpenters raised fortifications, and priests marched with the soldiers to bless the banners before battle. Every campaign was documented, every victory recorded in the royal annals. The Annales Regni Francorum reads like a play-by-play of an empire on the move. Yet, behind this machine was something deeply human: Charlemagne's obsession with control. He demanded reports, held yearly assemblies, and expected his nobles to obey without question. And they did, because he rewarded loyalty with land and favor, the twin currencies of medieval power. In a sense, Charlemagne reinvented feudalism before it even had a name. His warriors weren't just soldiers, they were investors in the empire's success. Their swords were contracts, their horses collateral, their loyalty the tax that kept the system alive. This balance of reward and discipline created a military network that could raise armies faster than any rival kingdom. But make no mistake, this was not some utopian machine. It was a beast fueled by conquest. Charlemagne's wars required constant tribute, labor, and obedience. Villages supplied grain, blacksmiths forged weapons, and monasteries minted coins to fund the campaigns. The church, too, played its part, sanctifying his wars as righteous and his enemies as infidels. To defy Charlemagne was to defy God. His empire became a blend of sword and scripture, one enforcing the other. When his armies marched, they didn't just bring death, they brought order, laws, and faith. And that's what made the Carolingian war machine unstoppable. It wasn't the biggest army, nor the most advanced, but it was the most purposeful. It was a system built on willpower and unity, on the belief that one man could shape destiny through discipline and divine mission. When Charlemagne rode at the head of his forces, clad in mail and crowned with purpose, he wasn't just a king, he was a symbol of Europe reborn. His army was the proof that chaos could be mastered, that faith could forge steel, and that, from the ruins of Rome, a new kind of empire could rise, not through marble or myth, but through men who believed their fight was history itself in motion. Once the Carolingian war machine was built, Charlemagne didn't let it sit idle. He unleashed it across the map like a divine storm. For him, conquest wasn't greed, it was destiny. Europe was still fractured, scattered among rival tribes and fading kingdoms. And Charlemagne saw himself as the chosen hand to unite it under one banner, one faith, one law. His campaigns were relentless. Year after year, the Frankish army rolled out like clockwork, crossing rivers, mountains, and borders with the efficiency of a kingdom possessed. His first target was the Lombards in Italy, an old, warlike people who had once threatened the very papacy that crowned his father. When the Pope called for help in 773, Charlemagne answered without hesitation. He marched his forces over the snow-choked Alps, through terrain most armies wouldn't dare cross, and descended on northern Italy like thunder. The Lombards, proud and confident behind their walls, expected the Franks to falter, but Charlemagne's siege engines and discipline broke their defenses one by one. In the end, their king surrendered, and Charlemagne took not only his crown, but his title, King of the Lombards. It was more than a victory. It was a message to the world. This was no ordinary warlord. From Italy, his gaze turned north and east, to the wild lands of the Saxons, pagans who worshipped old gods and refused to bend to Rome, or the cross. For 30 brutal years, Charlemagne waged a war that was as much about faith as power. The Saxon wars were not simple conquests. They were acts of conversion by the sword. Villages burned, temples were torn down, and those who resisted baptism were cut down without mercy. Harsh, absolutely. But in Charlemagne's eyes, it was divine justice, a holy war before that term even existed. To him, unity under Christianity was the only way to hold a continent together. The Franks fought with ruthless precision, building fortresses along the Elbe and Weser rivers, stationing garrisons to keep the tribes in check, and integrating the conquered lands into his growing empire. Yet the Saxons fought like ghosts, retreating into forests, striking back, and refusing to die quietly. It was a war of attrition, and Charlemagne, patient and unyielding, played the long game. But the Saxons weren't his only challenge. In the east, beyond the mountains, lay the Avars, a nomadic empire hoarding treasures and defiance. To Charlemagne, they represented not just another enemy but another test. In 791, he launched a campaign that would crush their cognate entirely. Frankish forces swept through the Danube basin, seizing the legendary Ring of the Avars, their fortified capital filled with gold, silver, and spoils taken from centuries of raids. The wealth poured into Charlemagne's coffers, funding new churches, new roads, and new armies. He had turned war into a self-sustaining engine, conquest paying for conquest. His empire stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the edges of Hungary, from the Pyrenees to the Baltic Sea, and everywhere his banner flew. The same system followed: Frankish law, Christian faith, and imperial order. Yet, what made Charlemagne unique wasn't just his military success. It was his understanding that war was meaningless without legacy. He rebuilt towns, opened schools, and reformed the church, ensuring that his empire was not merely won, it was structured to endure. His was not a barbarian kingdom, but a resurrection of Roman greatness, adapted to a medieval world. And in the year 800, the unthinkable happened. On Christmas Day, in the grand halls of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a golden crown upon Charlemagne's head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. The crowd erupted, the church bells rang, and for the first time in centuries, the title of emperor lived again, not in Constantinople, but in the West. The son of Pepin, grandson of Charles Martel, had revived the Roman Empire itself, now baptized in Frankish blood and Christian glory. That coronation wasn't just a ceremony. It was the symbolic rebirth of Europe. The dream of Rome had survived, reborn in steel and scripture. And in that moment, Charlemagne became more than a king. He became the father of medieval Europe. His empire wasn't perfect. It was stitched together by war and faith, by fear and loyalty, but it endured. And as the choirs echoed through Rome that winter morning, the message was clear: the age of tribes was over. The age of kings had begun. When Charlemagne died in 814, the world stood still. The emperor who had united half of Europe under one crown was gone, and the mighty machine he'd built began to slow. Yet even in death, his shadow stretched across centuries. The empire he left behind was vast, too vast, stitched together by loyalty, faith, and fear. And when the thread of his will was gone, it began to unravel. His only surviving son, Louis the Pious, inherited not just the crown, but the impossible task of holding together a realm that spanned oceans, forests, and tongues. Louis was devout and gentle, a man of prayer more than politics, and while he sought to continue his father's vision, he lacked the hammer that forged it. Noble families who had once trembled before Charlemagne now began testing their power, carving pieces from the empire like vultures circling a fallen giant. By the mid-9th century, the once mighty Carolingian Empire split under its own weight. After Louis's death, his sons turned against each other in a civil war that stained the empire with brotherly blood. The Treaty of Verdun in 843 carved the realm into three: West Francia, East Francia, and Middle Francia, the ancestors of what we now call France, Germany, and Italy. It was the end of Charlemagne's dream of a single Christian empire, but not the end of his influence. His laws, his institutions, his faith, they became the foundation stones of medieval Europe. The feudal order, born from the contracts and obligations he had crafted for his armies, became the default structure of European power. His alliance with the Church, once a political maneuver, evolved into the cornerstone of Western civilization, binding kings to popes and faith to governance. Every monarch who followed, from the Capetians of France to the Holy Roman Emperors of Germany, traced their legitimacy, in one way or another, back to him. Even centuries later, when Napoleon crowned himself emperor, he did so under the ghost of Charlemagne, seeking the same divine spark that had once lit the Carolingian throne. But Charlemagne's legacy wasn't just political, it was cultural. He ignited what historians now call the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning, art, and literacy in a world that had forgotten the light of Rome. Under his rule, schools were established, manuscripts copied, Latin standardized, and knowledge preserved. He gathered scholars from across Christendom: Alcuin of York, Paul the Deacon, Einhard, men who believed that wisdom was as vital to empire as the sword. Through them, Charlemagne became not only the father of Europe, but its teacher. He planted the seeds of Western education and administration, shaping how future kings ruled, wrote, and even prayed. His empire may have crumbled, but his ideals became immortal. Even the concept of Europe as a united Christian civilization, that began with him. Yet, history has its irony. The same system of loyalty and land that had built his strength would, centuries later, trap Europe in feudal stagnation. The same church that crowned him would one day clash with kings for power. Still, through every war, every crusade, every royal coronation that followed, the echo of his reign lingered, in law, in learning, and in legend. Charlemagne's very name became a myth, his sword a symbol, his rule a memory of what unity once looked like in an age of darkness. And while his empire faded, his identity never did. The Franks had once been a tribe. Under him, they became a civilization. He turned faith into empire, chaos into order, and ambition into history. More than 1,000 years later, his fingerprints remain on everything from the borders of nations to the language of law. When modern Europe was reborn from the ashes of two world wars, leaders like Churchill and Adenauer invoked the same vision. A united Europe, not through conquest this time, but through cooperation, yet inspired by the same idea that first drove Charlemagne. That strength lies not in division, but in unity. In the end, his empire died, but his dream survived. The Franks may have conquered lands, but Charlemagne conquered time itself. As the map of Charlemagne's empire fades beneath the dust of 1,000 years, one truth still stands. The Franks didn't just conquer lands. They conquered time. Their kingdoms fractured, their cities changed names, and their swords turned to relics. But their legacy, the dream of unity, of faith, of civilization reborn, still flows through Europe's veins. Every church bell that rings, every crown that gleams, every border drawn on the continent traces its shadow back to them. From the ashes of Rome to the dawn of modern nations, the story of the Franks reminds us that even in chaos, greatness can rise again. They forged Europe not just with blood and steel, but with vision. A vision powerful enough to outlive empires. And though centuries have passed, the echo of their march still lingers across the fields of France, the hills of Germany, and the heart of every history lover who dares to look back. Because, in the end, they didn't just rule an age, they built the world that came after it.